My dad, my future husband, wants to invite you to a family dinner before the wedding. My daughter texted me a day before she was set to walk down the aisle. During dinner, my future mother-in-law leaned over and said something in Korean to her son, and the two of them laughed as if I didn't exist. They thought I was just a failed old man who didn't understand a thing. I smiled, stood up, raised my glass, and answered them in perfect Korean. The entire room fell silent. Welcome and thanks for being here. Before we continue, please like the video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Note, this is a fictional story with dramatized elements for storytelling. Any similarities to real people or places are coincidental, but the ideas explored aim to offer meaningful and beneficial reflections. I don't need a magnifying glass to know when a man is trying to bury me, but today the shovel was made of 120-pound cream cardstock with a gold leaf border. I, Alaric Sterling, a 65-year-old retired textile importer, with silver hair and eyes that saw too much during my decades abroad, sat in my modest Chicago study, staring at a thick cream-colored envelope. The tactile grit of the gold leaf border felt like sandpaper against my calloused fingertips. This was no mere request for my presence at a wedding. It was a formal summons to a cage, a plan designed to lure me into a trap, where my very presence would legally validate a union meant to strip my daughter of everything I had built. Brian was overcompensating. Gold leaf doesn't hide the scent of desperation, and as I traced the raised ink of the Jade Pavilion address, I could practically smell the ozone from my old desk lamp mingling with the bitter taste of my cold coffee. I sat in the dim light, dissecting the card, not as a grieving father, but with the clinical detachment of the case officer I used to be. The cost of this single piece of paper was astronomical, far exceeding the modest salary of a supposed hedge fund manager. It was a message of dominance written in high-end stationery, 30 years of shadow work, and they thought I couldn't see a knife behind a smile. People like Brian Maxwell assume that a man who deals in silk and linen has forgotten how to recognize a wolf in the tall grass. They see the silver hair and the quiet house, and they mistake a strategic retreat for a surrender. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of my study felt like a countdown, a steady pulse in the silence of a home that had become far too quiet since Clare left. I knew the game he was playing. By inviting me so publicly with such fanfare, he was making it impossible for me to intervene without looking like the monster he had already convinced my daughter I was. It was a clever maneuver, the kind of psychological pincer move that works on ordinary men. But I have never been an ordinary man, and the textiles I imported were often just the shroud for much heavier things moving across borders. You see, when a predator thinks you're prey, they stop hiding their tracks. That was their first mistake. As I tilted the card under the sharp glint of my desk lamp, my eyes caught something the engraver hadn't intended for the general public to see. At the very bottom, pressed into the fibers with a stylus, was a nearly invisible line of Hangul. My breath hitched as I recognized the sharp, angular script of the Korean language. Gogiso. I read the word aloud, the syllables tasting like cold iron in my mouth. It was a specific, brutal insult, a term for a slaughterhouse animal, a beast being led to the pen. They weren't just inviting me. They were mocking the sheep before the slaughter. They thought I was the one walking into the trap. Calculated fury began to replace the cold analysis in my chest. I reached into the back of my desk drawer, moving past the old tax returns and stationery to a false panel that hadn't been opened in a decade. I picked up the black handset, the rotary dial clicking with a familiar, lethal rhythm as I dialed a number that didn't exist on any public record, activating a priority red asset through a channel they never expected me to remember. The ghost of a dial tone in my ear felt like a cold blade, but it was nothing compared to the way my daughter's voice had sliced through me 3 weeks ago. As I waited for the secure line to click into the digital ether, the sterile scent of my study vanished, replaced by the ghost of lemon polish and the blinding glare of the afternoon sun reflecting off Lake Michigan. I was back in that glass fortress on Wacker Drive, standing before the mahogany desk of Clare Sterling, 29, the sharp-suited CEO of Sterling Logistics, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance as she adjusted her engagement ring. I had come to her with a folder of anomalies, a quiet warning about the man she intended to marry. Brian Maxwell was a ghost. I told her a man with no verifiable digital footprint and a history that read like a forged passport. Men like that are either witnesses or hunters, but Claire didn't want a father. She wanted a blessing for a life I hadn't been invited to build. She revealed then that she had already moved the company's internal security audits away from my oversight weeks before, effectively gouging out my eyes inside the very firm I had helped her construct from the ground up. How do you tell the person you die for that they are walking straight into a fire they helped build? She stood up, the screech of her heavy chair against the marble floor, echoing like a scream in the quiet executive suite. To her, I wasn't a veteran of the Shadow Wars. I was just a xenophobic relic, a bitter old man who couldn't handle his daughter marrying into a Korean-American family because I hadn't personally vetted the groom. She told me this wasn't one of my overseas missions, and that my paranoia had finally cost me the only family I had left. I stood my ground, my voice remaining the calm, low baritone that had navigated interrogations in humid basement rooms, telling her I wasn't vetting a groom, I was scouting a threat. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated my tongue as the bridge between us finally collapsed. I watched the daughter I raised become a stranger, her defiance a shield made of glass that I knew was about to shatter. The memory of her thumb swiping across her phone to block my number felt like a physical weight in my palm as I stood in my silent study years later. The reason I had stayed so modest living in this unremarkable house and pretending to be a retired textile importer wasn't just to hide my CIA past from the world. It was a calculated sacrifice to keep the syndicate's eyes off her, a layers-deep protection she had just thrown away by inviting me to a rehearsal dinner where the wolves would be watching. By forcing me back into her orbit, she had unknowingly painted a target on both our backs. I felt the hollow vibration of the handset as the connection finally stabilized, bridging the gap between my life as a father and my duty as an operative. I watched the call-failed message pulse on my screen one last time before the ghost line finally clicked open and a voice I hadn't heard since 2016 whispered, "Station King, proceed." The voice on the other end of the line was like sandpaper on a fresh wound, Vance Prescott, the only man who still called me by my old call sign. "Station King, proceed." The words were a key turning in a lock I had hoped was rusted shut forever. I acknowledged the command with a clipped affirmative and ended the call, the silence of my study suddenly feeling heavy with the gravity of a deployment. A retired businessman might reach for his reading glasses when facing a crisis, but I reached for a loose floorboard in my back closet that hadn't been pried up since the Obama administration. The wood groaned in protest as I pulled it back, revealing a dust-covered crate that held the remnants of a life Claire never knew existed. She thinks her CEO position at Sterling Logistics was built on her own merit and my simple success as a textile importer. She has no idea that the entire business was a front, a carefully constructed East Asian logistics hub for CIA operations that I managed for 25 years. The very foundation of her world is a foundation of deep cover infrastructure, and every dollar of my $120 million fortune was earned in the shadows where the sun never shines. I reached into the crate, the smell of cedar and gun oil rising to meet me like an old friend. "Hello again," I whispered, my thumb tracing the cold steel of a discreet recording unit. "You were supposed to stay buried, but the Maxwells didn't leave me a choice." I began inspecting the gear with a practiced hand, checking the battery seals on a high-gain cufflink microphone and a portable signal jammer. In my world, a single slip of the tongue meant a shallow grave in the DMZ. In Claire's world, it just meant a bad Yelp review. The ironies of my life were beginning to stack up like cordwood. I had purposefully lived on a small fraction of my wealth, maintaining a modest house and a quiet car, to appear as an unappealing target to my former enemies. I had built a fortress of boredom around us, believing that if we stayed unremarkable, we would stay safe. But by letting Clare step into the spotlight as the head of the firm, I had inadvertently created the exact vulnerability I spent decades trying to avoid. She was a beacon now, and Brian Maxwell was the first predator to notice the light. The muscle memory came back, like a recurring fever, hot and inevitable. I felt the cool, smooth surface of a microtransmitter and the rough texture of an old encrypted passport that still had a few years before its fake expiration. I snapped a fresh battery housing shut with a satisfying click and adjusted a portable receiver. Claire thinks I'm a hoarder of old secrets, but she doesn't realize those secrets are the only reason she was allowed to grow up in the sun, oblivious to the wolves. The transmission frequency hissed into my hidden earpiece, a steady static that meant the channel was secure. I wasn't just going to that rehearsal dinner to watch from the sidelines. I had already planted a tracking device on the hem of her wedding dress delivery earlier that morning, while the courier was distracted. I had always been her shepherd, and a shepherd doesn't stop guarding the flock just because the sheep thinks the wolf is a friend. As I slipped the untraceable earpiece into place, a low-frequency pulse confirmed that Vance was already at the extraction point with the Maxwell file, and the first layer of their lie was about to be peeled away. The rainy Chicago street lamps smeared light across my windshield like blood as I drove toward the parking garage meeting. Rain lashed against the glass like 1,000 tiny needles trying to blur the path to a truth I already knew would be ugly. I guided my car into the cavernous, half-empty concrete structure near the loop, the rhythmic thud of water dripping from a corroded overhead pipe, providing a hollow percussion to the low hum of my engine. I waited in the shadows, my eyes scanning the mirrors for a tail, feeling the cold, damp weight of the air in my lungs. A nondescript sedan pulled into the space beside me. Vance Prescott, a 45-year-old FBI special agent with permanent dark circles under his eyes, met me in the shadows of the rainy parking garage. He stepped out of his vehicle, looking like a man who hadn't slept since the last administration, clutching a thick manila folder that smelled of cheap office coffee and high-stakes secrets. He looked at me with a weary sort of caution. He warned me that I was out of the game, and that if the Bureau found out he was feeding Station King, our careers were both finished. I didn't flinch. I told him not to feed the king, but to feed a father who was about to lose his daughter to a wolf in a custom tuxedo. Brian Maxwell was no ordinary groom. His supposed wealth was nothing more than a series of predatory loans from a syndicate that now held a bounty on his head. Claire's $120 million company wasn't just a prize to him. It was his only way to stay alive. Ever notice how the most dangerous men always have the whitest teeth and the firmest handshakes? I've seen it 1,000 times, from Istanbul to Seoul. The predators who dress in silk are always the ones who leave the deepest scars. I took the folder from Vance, the cold, damp texture of the paper sending a chill through my fingers. Under the dim, flickering amber light of a faulty fluorescent bulb that hummed with an annoying, high-pitched whine, I began to flip through the surveillance photos. The smell of wet asphalt and old exhaust hung heavy in the air as I processed the images. Brian Maxwell wasn't at a board meeting or a charity gala in these shots. He was standing outside a high-stakes illegal casino in Macau, looking far too comfortable in the company of men I recognized from old agency threat assessments. Vance explained that the hedge fund Brian claimed to manage was a total shell. It hadn't traded a legitimate stock in 3 years. He was the primary cleaner for a syndicate that specialized in the hostile takeovers of mid-cap logistics firms like the one my daughter now controlled. He was marrying her for the port access and the established shipping routes, a perfect conduit for a different kind of trade. One photo. That's all it took. Brian Maxwell was smiling in Seoul with a woman who definitely wasn't my daughter. But the revelation didn't stop with a secret mistress or a gambling debt. Vance leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain outside. He revealed that the FBI had been tracking Brian for 2 years, but they were letting the clock run. they needed the wedding to happen. They weren't after the small-time cleaner. They were waiting for the big fish behind the entire money-laundering operation to step into the light. That fish was Brian's mother. I felt the bitter metallic taste of fear in my mouth, but it was sharpened by a cold, calculating anger. Vance tapped a grainy photo of an elegant woman in the background of a casino, shot the same woman I was supposed to have dinner with in 2 hours. The Jade Pavilion was an exercise in architectural arrogance, all red lacquer and gold leaf, designed to make a man feel small before he even took his seat. I walked through the red lacquered doors, carrying a $120 million target on my back and a hidden FBI file in my heart. The heavy, cloying scent of sandalwood incense hung in the air, a thick blanket meant to stifle the senses. As I was led through the main hall, the muffled clinking of silver against bone china echoed like distant, polite warfare. According to the Vance dossier, I wasn't just walking into a restaurant. I was walking onto a stage where the syndicate held a silent, controlling interest. This was their ground, their execution block disguised as a 5-star dining experience. At the entrance to the private room, I was met by Brian Maxwell, 32, a hedge fund manager, with a smile as bright and hollow as a polished coin. He stood by Claire's side, his hand resting on the small of her back, with a possessive ease that made my pulse quicken with a calculated heat. "You're late, Dad," Claire said, her voice brittle with a visible embarrassment that cut deeper than any physical blow. "We were just about to start without you." I offered a humble nod, my expression a mask of weary apology. "The rain slowed me down, Claire," I replied smoothly. "But I wouldn't have missed this for anything." The gold leaf decorations on the walls looked less like art and more like the bars of a very expensive cage. I felt the dry, paper-like texture of the dinner menu in my hands as I took my seat. But my focus remained on the woman sitting at the head of the table. Eleanor Maxwell, 58, draped in silk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, sat with the poise of a queen ruling a crumbling kingdom. She was exactly as she had appeared in the Macau casino photos, elegant, composed, and radiating a quiet, predatory authority that most people would mistake for high society grace. Claire looked at me with a defensive stiffness, her posture a silent plea for me not to ruin the evening with my usual questions. I lowered my eyes, playing the role of the simple textile importer who had lived a small, unremarkable life. It was a role I had perfected over decades, the invisible man who sees everything because nobody bothers to look at him twice. The red lacquer table felt cold and smooth beneath my palms, a sterile surface for the games being played above it. I looked at my daughter and saw a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, cheering for the person about to push her. Eleanor treated me with a patronizing warmth, her words dripping with a fake sincerity that set my nerves on edge. She remarked on how charming it was that I had raised such a successful daughter with such a small, importing business, her tone suggesting that my life was a quaint curiosity compared to the sophisticated world her son occupied. "It was enough to keep us fed, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice low and respectful. I was never one for the big city lights. As I spoke, I felt a slight, sharp vibration in my cuff, the discreet signal from the transmitter I'd concealed. Vance's team had lost their surveillance feed. A localized jammer had been activated inside the building. We were officially in the dark, isolated in the heart of the city. Eleanor leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light with a predatory glint, and whispered a traditional Korean greeting, but her eyes told me she was counting the seconds until my daughter signed her life away. The appetizers arrived like colorful decoys meant to distract me from the interrogation Brian was about to launch. Brian leaned back, swirling his vintage wine like a man who had already won the race, and began the questioning he thought was a casual conversation. I realized almost immediately that this wasn't just small talk. It was a field test. He was probing my background in textiles not out of interest, but to see if my old logistics roots could be used as a front for his syndicate's smuggling operations. He wanted to know if I was the perfect fall guy. I played my part with the slow, methodical precision of a man who had nothing to hide because his life was too boring to lie about. I leaned forward, my scratchy wool blazer bunching at the shoulders, and began to drone on about cotton blends in the 90s. I talked about customs tariffs on polyester until I saw the light die in his eyes. I gave him hyper-specific, mind-numbing details about industrial looms and shipping delays in the South China Sea from 1994. Brian's predatory white-toothed grin faltered, replaced by a glazed look of polite boredom. Claire watched us, her face flushed with a cringing social tension. "Dad, please," she interrupted, her voice tight. "Brian doesn't need a history lesson on industrial looms. Do you know the easiest way to disappear? You let people believe you're exactly as boring as they want you to be. Most men in this room want to be the sun, the center of every conversation, drawing every eye. I preferred to be the gray wallpaper, the background noise that everyone hears but no one listens to." While Brian recovered from my lecture on textile tariffs, I turned my attention to the condensation on my glass of iced water. I watched a single droplet slide down the side, a mirror to the way I was slipping past their defenses. Eleanor was watching me now, her high-pitched fake laughter punctuating the air as she spoke to Clare about the Maxwell family's charitable foundations. She was marking territory, making it clear that I was a lower-class beneficiary of their grand association. She looked at me with increasing disdain, her eyes lingering on my cheap functional watch. "It must be a comfort to know your daughter is finally in hands that can secure her future, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone dripping with patronizing elitism. I offered her a slow, humble smile. "I just want her to be happy, ma'am. I'm a simple man with simple expectations." He was hunting for a lie. I was feeding him the truth, but only the parts that didn't matter. My internal CIA-trained radar was screaming at the way Eleanor avoided looking at the waitstaff, a classic sign of someone who viewed others as tools rather than humans. I felt the faint metallic scent of the heavy silverware as I picked up my fork, my hands steady. Every move I made was a calculated performance. I purposefully, accidentally, spilled a small drop of water on my sleeve, a clumsy gesture of an old man losing his edge. As I reached for a napkin to dab at the damp fabric, I used the motion to adjust my cufflink, ensuring the hidden microphone was angled perfectly toward Eleanor. I felt the slight vibration of the housing against my skin, a confirmation that I had a clear audio lock. I was no longer just a guest. I was a recording device in the heart of the enemy's den. Eleanor caught Brian's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, her lips curving into a thin, cruel line as she prepared to speak the words she thought I'd never understand. The transition was seamless, a smooth glide from the stilted English of a polite host to the razor-sharp, rapid-fire Korean of a woman who thought she was invisible in plain sight. As the steam rose from the oolong tea in my cup, Eleanor turned her bird-like head toward Brian and began to speak with a cold, staccato efficiency. She didn't know that my years in Seoul weren't spent merely trading fabrics, or that she was sitting across from a man who knew her reputation long before she stepped into this restaurant. In the Seoul underworld, Eleanor was known as a sultang, a ruthless money broker who specialized in laundering the debts of the desperate. Now she looked at me with a thin, cruel smile, while calling me a decrepit peasant in a language she assumed was a wall between us. She mocked the cheap cut of my blazer, laughing about how easy it would be to push me into a nursing home the moment the wedding papers were finalized. Brian nodded along, his eyes glinting with a shared arrogance. He told her to be patient, that the peasant was the only one who could sign over the logistics infrastructure they needed to bridge their Macau debts. I sipped my tea, the liquid hot and bitter, my face as unreadable as a stone wall, while the recording device in my cufflink hummed against my skin, capturing every syllable of their disdain. To them, I was a ghost in the room. Little did they know I was the one haunting the house they were trying to steal. My grip on the white linen napkin tightened beneath the table, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and shallow. I played the part of the confused, slightly deaf old man, perfectly leaning in, as if straining to hear a conversation I wasn't meant to understand. Eleanor didn't stop with me. She turned her linguistic assault toward Clare, calling my daughter a stupid, Lonely girl who was so desperate for affection, she would hand over $100 million empire just for a kind word and a wedding ring. Brian let out a soft, sharp laugh in Korean, admitting he almost felt bad for her, but then reminded his mother that $12 million in gambling debt tended to kill a man's sympathy. They spoke of Claire as if she were a transaction, a clean vessel to be emptied and discarded once the logistics routes were secured for their syndicate partners. Have you ever sat across from someone who was planning to kill your legacy while they offered you a piece of bread? It's an acquired taste. The underlying smell of expensive perfume and betrayal was thick enough to choke on, yet I maintained my mask. I watched the clink of porcelain against the lacquered wood, a rhythmic domestic sound, masking a conversation about the end of my family. Eleanor reached for a piece of dim sum, her diamonds catching the light with a predatory shimmer. She mentioned casually to Brian that his real girlfriend, Sophia Vance, was already in Chicago, staying at a luxury hotel paid for by a Sterling Logistics corporate credit card Brian had skimmed weeks ago. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold fury settling into my marrow. I looked at Claire, who was smiling at Brian, oblivious to the fact that her own hard-earned money was sheltering the woman her fiancé actually loved. Eleanor smiled at me, then her eyes as cold as a frozen lake, and asked in perfect English if I liked the tea. I nodded, offering a vacuous smile while her last Korean sentence still echoed in my ears. We kill the old man's influence tomorrow. The name Sophia Vance hit me like a physical blow, a ghost from Brian's Macau files, finally taking shape in the middle of our dinner table. I watched the steam rise from my tea, a white shroud for the daughter who was currently being measured for a financial coffin right in front of me. I remained composed, keeping my eyes downward as if focused on the delicate floral pattern of the porcelain. Brian began to explain the strategy to his mother in Korean, his tone a mix of pride and clinical indifference. He described Sterling Logistics as the perfect vault, a clean vessel for dirty water. Because of its spotless audit history and massive daily cash flow, it was the ideal conduit for funneling syndicate funds through ghost shipments. I realized then that Claire wasn't just being robbed. She was being set up as the ultimate fall girl for a federal money laundering operation. While I sat there playing the part of the simple father, Brian revealed he had already hacked into Claire's personal phone. He was sending automated cheerful messages to her friends to isolate her, ensuring no one would notice the subtle shift in her behavior as the wedding approached. A vault, that's what they called my little girl. A box to be stuffed with filth and then burned. The dry sound of Eleanor's laughter grated against my nerves, a sharp contrast to the scent of expensive lilies arranged in the center of the table. She shifted the conversation toward Sophia Vance, noting that the woman was becoming impatient in her Chicago hotel. Brian didn't even flinch. He reassured his mother that the wedding was the final key and that Claire's own corporate credit cards were already being used to cover Sophia Vance's luxury expenses at a Gold Coast suite. I felt a surge of protective rage, a heat that threatened to melt my mask of calm. My hard-earned legacy, the life I had built to keep Claire safe, was being used to wine and dine the woman intended to replace her. I watched Brian check his expensive watch, a timepiece likely bought with the proceeds of another man's ruin, and I wondered how many other lives he had dismantled before turning his sights on us. Have you ever sat through a dinner where you were the only one who knew the menu was written in blood? It requires a specific kind of stomach. I took a sip of my tea, but it had steeped too long and tasted bitter, mirroring the cold fury settling in my chest. I watched the vibration of a phone on the table, Brian's phone, as he dismissed a notification with a flick of his thumb. They weren't just planning a quiet divorce after the assets were stripped. Through their rapid-fire Korean banter, I discovered the darker truth. Once the joint authority papers were signed and the assets fully transferred, they were planning a tragic accident for Claire. A bridge, a mechanical failure, a headline in the morning paper. My daughter was a loose end they intended to tie off. Brian raised his glass to me, his smile as sharp as a scalpel, while his mother whispered the final order in Korean, her voice barely a breath. She told him to make sure Claire signed the proxy before she even left the church steps. I met his gaze, offering a vapid, elderly smile of my own, while my mind was already calculating the exact number of seconds I would need to burn their world to the ground. The conversation returned to English as the main course arrived, a beautifully plated lie served on a bed of cultural arrogance. I sipped my water, the cool liquid doing nothing to extinguish the fire spreading through my veins, as I watched the man my daughter loved describe her death in Korean as a favorable liquidation. A waiter approached with a bottle of sparkling water, his movements fluid and precise. As he refilled my glass, his eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and I felt a surge of cold reassurance. He was a ghost asset from my old CIA days in the Pacific Rim, a man I'd helped relocate a decade ago. It confirmed I had physical backup inside the Jade Pavilion's kitchen, but for now I was still the only one standing between Claire and the grave they were digging for her. As the sea base was placed before me, the searing heat of the ginger and chili reached my nose, a sharp, clean scent that matched my rising tactical focus. I purposefully fumbled with my heavy chopsticks, letting them clatter against the cold, clinical touch of the porcelain plate. Eleanor tilted her head like a bird watching a worm, her expression softening into a patronizing pity. She asked if the fish was too spicy or if I needed something simpler, and I offered a vacuous, apologetic smile. "Oh no, it's lovely, Eleanor," I said, my voice wavering just enough to sell the weakness. "Just these hands of mine, they aren't what they used to be." How do you maintain a grandfatherly smile when the man across from you is picking out the color of your daughter's funeral casket? Brian and his mother resumed their staccato Korean, discussing the logistics of a mechanical failure for a vehicle Claire would be driving shortly after the honeymoon. I sat there, a picture of doting confusion, while my mind was already calculating the forensics of a crime that hadn't happened yet. I was translating every threat, every whispered detail of their plan into a mental digital file for Agent Vance. I feigned a dry, sudden coughing fit, bringing my hand up to my face and surreptitiously pressing my wrist against my cheek. I felt the rhythmic, almost imperceptible vibration of the recording LED against my skin. One pulse, one light. The evidence was live. The hunt was officially on. I caught Claire's eye and offered a reassuring fake smile. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You look a little pale." I patted her hand, the smell of expensive rainwater on her coat, a reminder of the storm waiting for her outside this restaurant. "Just the excitement, Claire," I lied. "It's not every day I see my only daughter find such a lucrative future." The city traffic outside the pavilion was a muffled, distant hum, a different world from the one inside this red-lacquered den. I sat back, finishing the last of the fish, while listening to Brian boast in Korean about how much he was skimming from his own syndicate masters to fund a private escape. He wasn't just a predator. He was a parasite, making him a target for both me and the very criminals he served. He was a man with two different nooses tightening around his neck, yet he still had the arrogance to toast my health. As the dinner plates were cleared, Brian subtly adjusted the strap of his own watch, and I felt the air in the room vanish as I realized he was checking the exact same timestamp I was. Brian didn't just hide the knife. He polished the blade right in front of me, assuming the old man in the wool blazer was too blind to see the reflection of his own ruin. The check hadn't even arrived when he leaned in, his voice dropping to that smooth, manipulative baritone he used to sell Claire her own destruction. He pulled out his smartphone, the blue light glare of the screen momentarily illuminating the predatory sharpness of his features. He tilted the device toward Eleanor, claiming he was showing her a photo of the honeymoon suite they had picked out in Macau. In reality, the screen displayed a high-resolution scan of page 8 of the newly forged prenuptial agreement. My eyes, trained by decades of scanning surveillance transcripts in dim basements, didn't need to look directly at the phone to catch the details. I leaned in under my senile cover, pretending to squint at what I called a complicated picture, while I memorized the document's header and the specific watermark of Claire's own law firm. Brian had compromised her lawyer's digital server. Any official check she performed would now show this fake document as the legitimate one. He explained in rapid, cocky Korean how he had replaced the standard liability clause with a cross-ownership trust mandate, effectively turning my daughter's legacy into his personal ATM, 100 million. They weren't just stealing her future. They were strip-mining my life's work for parts. I felt the metallic static taste of the hidden microphone in my ear as the Maxwells laughed in their native tongue about how easy the conquest had been. Brian boasted that Clare had signed the final version between cake tastings far too distracted by the guest list and the floral arrangements to read the small print. He whispered the exact account numbers to his mother, a series of digits that my internal database immediately tagged as a known laundering hub in the Cayman Islands. The clause was designed to trigger the moment the priest said, "Amen," immediately moving a staggering $100 million of Sterling Logistics liquid capital into that offshore void. The scent of expensive leather from Brian's phone case wafted toward me. As he tucked the device away, the dry, paper-cut sound of Eleanor's whispers filling the gaps in his boast. They weren't just planning a robbery. They were preparing a funeral. Once the funds moved, the accident could proceed. "No loose ends," Eleanor murmured, her eyes flicking to me with the cold indifference one might show a piece of furniture destined for the curb. Have you ever wanted to reach across a table and end a man's life? My training told me to wait. My heart told me to move. The faint hum of the restaurant's climate control seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed their laughter. I sat there, the reflective, wise father playing his part to the bitter end, even as I realized the depths of the vendetta I was facing. Brian's $12 million debt wasn't just to some random mob syndicate. It was owed specifically to a man I had personally put in a federal prison 10 years ago during an operation in Seoul. This wasn't just a con. It was a targeted strike. Brian was the weapon, but the hand guiding him was seeking a decade-old revenge against Alaric Sterling. I watched him tuck his phone away with a smirk, unaware that the ghost of the man he was robbing had just downloaded the entire roadmap to his own execution. The check arrived, settled in seconds by Brian with a flourish of Claire's corporate credit card, the first of many thefts I would allow tonight. I stood up slowly, my calculated anger hidden behind a mask of weary gratitude, ready to walk into the night and begin the counteroffensive. I followed them out the red lacquered doors of the Jade Pavilion, swinging shut behind us as the cold Chicago rain reclaimed the evening. The rain didn't just wash away the smell of expensive oolong tea. It froze the final bridge between me and my daughter as she stepped into a gilded cage and slammed the door. On the sidewalk, under the rhythmic buzzing of a nearby faulty neon sign, I pulled Claire slightly away from the group. The smell of ozone and wet pavement was sharp, matching the electricity crackling between us. "Claire, just give me 10 minutes tomorrow," I said, keeping my voice low and urgent. No lawyers, no Brian, just us. I could see the reflection of the streetlights in her eyes, but the warmth was gone. Instead, she revealed that she had revoked my emergency access to the Sterling Logistics server earlier that evening. She called it setting boundaries, but I knew she was dismantling her own safety net. "Stop it, Dad," she snapped. "You've spent the whole night looking at them like they're criminals. You're embarrassing me, and you're embarrassing yourself." Brian intervened immediately, his custom tuxedo barely dampened by the mist, as he placed a protective arm around her. He looked at me with a smirk that was perfectly disguised as concern, playing the role of the gallant defender, while I was cast as the confused, overbearing father. She didn't just turn her back. She turned her life over to a man who saw her as a rounding error. I watched them walk toward the curb, where the valet was holding the door of Brian's luxury SUV. The isolation felt physical, a cold pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind. Eleanor Maxwell stood back, watching the exchange with a smug, knowing smile that told me she had won this round of the psychological war. "I'll see you at the church, Alaric," she said, her tone dripping with a patronizing warmth. "If you can find it without a map." I didn't reply. I just stood there, the rain feeling like shards of ice against my skin, tasting the salt of either the downpour or a single suppressed tear. Claire climbed into the back of the vehicle without a backward glance. "Drive, Brian," she said, her voice muffled by the closing door. "Just drive." The hiss of tires on wet asphalt followed, accompanied by a blinding spray of water that soaked my trousers. The taillights of their car were two red eyes mocking me from the darkness. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the flickering neon casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. But the embarrassing scene I had caused wasn't just a father's desperation. It was a tactical distraction. While Brian was busy playing the hero, and Claire was busy being ashamed of me, I had managed to lean against the rear of the SUV long enough to plant a long-range acoustic bug on the underside of the chassis. The muscle memory was still there, the quick, invisible placement I'd practiced 1,000 times in busier streets than this. I pulled out my phone, the screen illuminating my wet face, the vibration of the glass against my cold thumb feeling like a lifeline. I didn't need a map to find the Maxwells. I had their heartbeat on my screen. I typed 5 words to Vance that would end their charade and set my own plan in motion: execute the debt acquisition. Now, I watched their car disappear into the Chicago night, ready to move from the defense to a clinical, calculated offense. The 24-hour diner smelled of burnt grease and desperation, a fitting place to discuss the price of a man's soul. The smell of cheap floor wax shouldn't have felt like home, but in my line of work, the best truths are usually traded over lukewarm coffee and a cracked vinyl booth. I sat in the corner, my back to the wall, watching the neon sign outside flicker with a rhythmic buzz that echoed the static in my own mind. Vance Prescott slid a tablet across the scarred laminate table, the blue-white glow of the screen cutting through the dim shadows of the dark booth. He looked at me with those tired eyes, the smell of old rain and diesel still clinging to his jacket. Brian Maxwell's life was laid bare in a series of encrypted ledgers from an illegal Macau-based sportsbook. The numbers were staggering: $12,450,000. The debt had been compounding for 18 months, like a malignant tumor. It was clear now that Brian's hedge fund was never an investment vehicle. It was a desperate, multi-layered Ponzi scheme designed solely to keep the syndicate's enforcers from his mother's door. But the ledger held a deeper poison. Vance leaned in the screech of a metal chair on the diner floor, puncturing the silence, and revealed that Brian had used Claire's Sterling Logistics name as an unauthorized personal guarantor for the loan. He hadn't just stolen her heart. He had put her entire company in the crosshairs of a mob seizure. $12 million. Most people see a fortune. I saw a guillotine. 12 million isn't just a debt. Vance, I said, the bitter, overboiled taste of the diner coffee coating my tongue like ash. It's a death sentence. No wonder he's so eager to merge the accounts. He needs her legacy to pay for his sins. Vance shook his head, his face a mask of grim clinical realization. The syndicate doesn't want the money anymore, Alaric. They want the logistics routes. Brian is just the key to the front door. They want the ports, the warehouses, the very infrastructure I spent 30 years building to protect my daughter. I scrolled through the names on the screen, my mind already pivoting from a father's grief to an operative's cold-blooded determination. I explained my debt acquisition strategy to a skeptical Vance. If I could buy Brian's debt from the syndicate's U.S. representative, I would become his sole legal creditor. I could freeze every asset he attempted to touch, legally pinning him to the ground before he could sign a single wedding document. Do you know what the difference is between a businessman and a predator? A businessman wants a profit. A predator just wants to see you stop breathing. Vance warned me that walking into a warehouse to hand a professional killer $15 million was a suicide mission. He thought I was alone. I told him I'd be bringing 30 years of reasons why they should take the deal and run. The distant hum of a passing freight train vibrated through the booth, a low-frequency reminder of the world moving outside our bubble of secrets. I knew the man I had to meet. The syndicate's U.S. representative was a ghost from my own past, a man I personally saved during a failed extraction in Hong Kong back in 2004. It was a debt of blood, a currency far more valuable than the liquid cash I was currently moving from my offshore holdings. I closed the tablet and looked out the window at the rain, knowing that by this time tomorrow I would either own my son-in-law's soul or I wouldn't be alive to see the wedding. The industrial district of Chicago is a graveyard of rusted steel and broken promises, the perfect place for a dead man to negotiate for a life. The rust on the warehouse gates tasted like old blood in the morning fog, a grim reminder that in my old life, meetings like this usually ended with a shovel or a checkbook. I guided my car through the heavy sliding door that echoed in the void, the smell of damp concrete and industrial grease thick in the air. I stepped out into the shadows, my ears immediately picking up the sharp click of a safety being engaged somewhere above the catwalks. Han Wul, the syndicate's U.S. representative with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jawline, a gift from the triads I'd stopped in 2004, emerged from the warehouse office like a predator sensing a rival. He didn't offer a hand, and I didn't expect one. He revealed that his men were already preparing to liquidate Brian Maxwell tonight. The boy had become a liability they no longer wished to carry. My arrival hadn't just interrupted their schedule. My buyout offer was the only thing keeping Brian from a permanent sleep in the lake. I looked Han Wul in the eye, my voice calm and steady. I told him I wasn't there for a favor but to settle a ledger. "You saved my life in Kowloon Station, King," he rumbled, his eyes tracing the gray in my hair. "But 15 million is a lot of weight for a ghost to carry." Click. The wire was verified. $15 million vanished from a blind account in Zurich, and I became the most dangerous man in Brian Maxwell's world. I sat at a scarred metal table, the blue light glare of my satellite laptop illuminating the predatory lines of Han Wul's face. "The money is in the ether," I said, my thumb hovering over the delete key. "Give me the paper." He slid a heavy manila folder across the table toward me, its cold weight a physical manifestation of Brian's ruin. Inside were the original promissory notes, the predatory loan agreements, and the forged Sterling Logistics guarantor forms that Brian had thought would be his salvation. In that moment, the power shifted. I was no longer a concerned father pleading for his daughter's attention. I was the sole legal creditor for a $12 million debt. I owned the heir. Brian breathed the clothes on his back and every second of his remaining future. Han Wul leaned back, a dark amusement flickering in his eyes, as he told me Brian was all mine now, and to try not to make too much of a mess at the wedding. Most fathers buy their daughters a wedding gift. I bought her the man who was trying to kill her body and soul. I began flipping through the secondary documents in the folder, my eyes widening as I discovered a second layer to the betrayal. Brian hadn't just collateralized Clare's company. He had used his own mother's secret offshore retirement fund as additional security. He had bet the Maxwell matriarch's entire future on a hand he was destined to lose. I realized I didn't just have a creditor's claim against a small-time con man. I had the key to Eleanor's absolute ruin. The woman who had mocked my cheap blazer and patronized my small life was now quite literally living on my mercy. I gripped the heavy folder, the ink on the transfer documents still feeling wet to my touch, and felt a cold, lethal triumph settle into my bones. The Maxwells had spent months planning an accident for my daughter, unaware that the shepherd had already built a cage for the entire pack. I walked back to my car, the morning fog finally beginning to lift, ready to prepare the final notification for a bride who still believed in fairy tales. The silence of my study at 2 a.m. was a lie, a thin veil over the storm I was about to unleash in a 2,000-word warning Clare was destined to ignore. The blue light of the monitor was a cold substitute for the warmth of a daughter's trust, but at this hour, it was the only bridge I had left to build. I sat there, the rhythmic tapping of keys echoing through the silent house as I meticulously poured every piece of evidence into a digital manifesto. I attached the scans of the debt acquisition from Han Wool, the grainy surveillance photos of Sophia Vance in her Gold Coast suite, and the decrypted FBI ledgers. I didn't write as the tactical operative station king, but as a father whose heart was breaking for a child who no longer knew his voice. I revealed the truth of my CIA background, finally providing the context for the paranoia she so deeply resented. I wrote that I never wanted her to know the man I was, because that man didn't deserve a daughter like her. I begged her not to believe me blindly, but simply to read the facts because the truth doesn't need her permission to be real. However, a darker discovery surfaced as I worked. Brian had installed a specialized filter on her accounts that specifically triggered on keywords like FBI, debt, and CIA, ensuring my warnings would never reach her eyes. 20 years of coding firewalls for the agency, and I couldn't get a single "I love you" past a 2-bit con man's filter. It was a staggering realization of how deeply Brian had already burrowed into the infrastructure of her life. I watched the cooling electronics hum, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air as I hit the send button. I expected the weight to lift, or at least to feel the minor relief of a duty performed. Instead, the screen flashed an immediate, brutal error message blocked. Address not found, or recipient is not accepting mail. The stinging dryness in my eyes grew sharper as the mechanical click of the mouse rang out in the void. She didn't just close the door, I whispered to the empty room. She bricked over it. Brian was far better at isolating his targets than I had given him credit for. He had convinced her that scrubbing my entire digital existence was a necessary step for her mental health and wedding preparations. Do you know what silence sounds like at 3 a.m? It sounds like a death warrant. I leaned back in my chair, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat on life support. But Brian Maxwell, for all his arrogance, had forgotten one thing: you don't play chess with a man who helped write the manual on Grandmaster strategy. I revealed to the empty air that I had anticipated this digital block from the very first keystroke. The email wasn't just a message, it was a ping. Hidden within the text was a tracking pixel designed to bypass standard firewalls and report back the exact GPS coordinates of the device that received the bounce-back notification. Even a blocked email leaves a trail of breadcrumbs if you know how to read the bread. I stared at the bouncing, undeliverable icon and realized that if I wanted to save her, I was going to have to walk into her office and let her see the monster she thought I was. The Sterling Logistics Building was a fortress, but no fortress is impenetrable to a man who knows where the foundations are buried. The Sterling Logistics Building stood like a glass fortress against the Chicago skyline, a monument to a family legacy that was currently being sold for parts. The lobby was a cathedral of glass and steel, but as I stepped through the revolving doors, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and it wasn't just the Chicago wind following me in. The cold, sterile scent of filtered air and floor wax hit me like a physical wall. I reached for my executive keycard, a piece of plastic that had granted me entry to this sanctum for 30 years, and slid it into the reader at the elevator bank. The high-pitched whine of the elevator gears was interrupted by a sharp electronic rejection. The reader glowed a violent, accusatory red. I hadn't even processed the failure before a broad-shouldered man in a crisp Navy uniform, a man I'd personally vetted 3 years ago, stepped into my path with a look of genuine regret. This was the security team leader, a man who once looked at me with respect, but was now holding a metallic click of a walkie-talkie like a shield. He informed me that my credentials had been flagged for immediate revocation. I soon discovered the depth of Brian's poison. He had filed a fabricated report claiming I'd made verbal threats against the wedding party, using the company's own safety protocols to ban me from the building. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable register. The CEO's orders were very specific. No exceptions for family today. I looked him in the eye, seeing the conflict in his face. "The CEO is being lied to, son," I told him. "And you're being paid to hold the door open for the thief." I was a ghost in a fortress I'd spent 30 years building haunting the hallways of a legacy that no longer recognized my touch. Every stone in this lobby was laid under my supervision, yet today I was treated like a common intruder. Two other guards stepped forward, their presence a silent, heavy command. They guided me back toward the street with a firm but gentle efficiency that felt like a burial. As we moved toward the exit, I feigned a stumble near the main elevator bank, letting my wallet slip from my pocket. It hit the marble floor with a soft thud, sliding just under a decorative planter. Inside that leather fold was a high-speed data skimmer I'd activated in my car, a device that would now begin a quiet, invisible harvest of the building's internal firewall, while the security team remained focused on my face. The biting chill of the Chicago wind hit my face the moment I crossed the threshold, a harsh reality after the climate-controlled silence of the lobby. I didn't leave immediately. I paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the 42nd floor, squinting against the glare of the morning sun. There, against the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw Clare's silhouette. She was a dark, rigid line against the sky, her posture telegraphing a frantic energy as she talked on a phone. For one agonizing second, she looked down, and I knew our eyes met through a quarter-mile of reinforced glass. "Just 1 minute, Clare, just look at the file." I shouted at the wind, but the sound was devoured by the roar of the city. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached out. I heard the imaginary sound of heavy fabric sliding across a metal track as she drew the heavy motorized blinds. The blinds didn't just close, they sealed the tomb. I watched the shadow of my daughter vanish behind the gray fabric and realized that Father O'Brien was the only man left in Chicago who could help me stop this marriage without a bullet. St. Jude's Cathedral was the only place in Chicago where the silence didn't feel like an interrogation. But today, I was here to ask a holy man to help me commit a strategic deception. St. Jude's smelled of beeswax and centuries of prayers, a sanctuary of silence, where I intended to commit a necessary sin. I stepped into the dim sacristy, the chill of the hallowed air, a sharp contrast to the biting wind I'd left on the sidewalk. Father O'Brien, a man with a voice like gravel over silk and eyes that had heard the sins of Chicago's most powerful for 40 years, stood in the shadows of the altar. He turned toward me, his expression softening with the familiarity of a decade-long friendship, but I offered no pleasantries. Instead, I laid out the evidence of Brian Maxwell's criminal ties and the forged trust agreement. I revealed that Brian had already visited the church that morning, attempting to bribe the parish secretary to file the marriage license electronically the second the vows were finished. It was a calculated move to anchor the legal union before I could even draw breath. I explained that if the wedding proceeded normally, Clare would be tethered to a federal fugitive. I wasn't asking him to stop the ceremony, but for a delay in the administrative processing, the one thing within his power to grant. "I am not asking you to lie to God, Father." I whispered, my hand resting on the rough texture of an old wooden pew. "I am asking you to withhold a signature from the state for 24 hours. He looked at me for a long moment, the guttering light of red votive candles dancing in his pupils. "Alaric, you're asking me to turn a sacrament into a sting operation," he replied, the weight of the moral conflict evident in his tired voice. "Sacrilege. That's what some would call it. I just called it a safety catch. Most men come here to find peace, but I had come to find time." I could see the struggle in his posture, the shepherd weighing the rules of the institution against the life of a sheep he knew was headed for the blade. The scent of cold stone and frankincense seemed to intensify as he considered the evidence I had provided. I told him I would take the sin on my own soul, but I needed that window. I needed the FBI to have enough room to strike before the legal union became an unbreakable chain around Clare's neck. The flickering prayer candles looked like 1,000 small eyes watching me trade a holy vow for a tactical advantage. Father O'Brien finally nodded, his decision made. "A father's first duty is protection, Alaric," he said softly. "I will pray for your daughter's safety and for your soul." He agreed to misplace the paperwork for a single day, a delay that would leave the marriage in a legal limbo. I left a $10,000 donation for the youth fund on the table, a silent payment for the burden I was placing on his conscience. I turned toward the heavy, muffled thud of the cathedral doors, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty nave. But as I reached the exit, my tactical training flared. I noticed the security guards Clare had hired for the perimeter men with the flat eyes and thick necks of professional enforcers. I realized then that they weren't private security at all. They were syndicate muscle. As I walked out of the heavy oak doors, I noticed a black sedan with tinted windows idling across the street, the same one that had followed me from the warehouse. And I knew the time for quiet conversations was officially over. The sunset over Lake Michigan was the color of a bruised heart, a warning that the morning would bring either my daughter's salvation or my own extinction. I didn't bother turning on the lights when I got back to the house. In my world, the most effective weapons are forged in the dark and signed with an invisible hand. The drive home had been a choreographed dance of high-speed maneuvers through Chicago's side streets, a necessary sequence to lose the black sedan that had been glued to my bumper since the cathedral. I realized then that the car didn't belong to the syndicate enforcers. It was a private security firm Brian had hired to babysit me until the ceremony began. The groom wasn't just waiting for the wedding. He was already actively hunting me, ensuring I stayed within the lines of the role he'd scripted for the senile father-in-law. I slipped into my study, the blue light glare of my laptop stinging my tired eyes as I bypassed the standard banking firewalls. "If you want my throne, Brian," I whispered to the empty room, "you're going to have to find it first." I initiated execution sequence Alpha 6, the Midnight Poison Pill Protocol, that would dissolve my domestic identity in a matter of hours. Click. $10 million vanished into the ether. Click. Another 20. It's remarkably easy to become invisible when you have enough digits and the right encryption keys. The mechanical whir of the laptop cooling fan was the only sound in the room, accompanied by the dry electronic smell of the encrypted router working at peak capacity. One by one, I watched the progress bars crawl across the screen, systematically incinerating the legacy I had spent 30 years building. My domestic accounts, the textile firm's holdings, and my personal retirement funds were being siphoned out of the American banking system. Even the title to this very house was being transferred into the untraceable reaches of the Silver Shepherd Trust. I was pruning my own life, like a dying tree, cutting away the branches so the roots could survive the winter. By the time the clock hit 3 a.m., the transformation was complete. On paper, Alaric Sterling legally owned nothing but the clothes on his back and the secrets in his head. The cross-ownership clause Brian had worked so hard to forge was now mathematically worthless, a bridge leading to a canyon that had already been emptied of its gold. I am now officially a pauper, Vance, I thought, feeling the cold metallic surface of the trust key USB drive against my palm. A pauper with a very expensive list of enemies. The distant lonely sound of a morning foghorn drifted in from the lake, a somber herald of the coming dawn. I confirmed the receipt of the trust keys sealing the vault for good. But the Silver Shepherd Trust wasn't just a hiding place for my money. I had designed its board of directors to consist entirely of retired agency contacts, men and women who lived in the same shadows I did. By moving Clare's eventual inheritance into their hands, I had effectively given them the legal right to audit anyone who dared to marry into the Sterling name. Brian thought he was marrying a fortune, but he was actually inviting a legion of professional investigators into his bedroom. I closed the laptop and watched the sun begin to creep over the lake, the light reflecting off the water in jagged silver shards. I knew that in 4 hours I would walk my daughter toward a man who thought he was winning a prize, only to find he was wedded to a debt he could never pay. 5 in the morning in Chicago is a gray, uncertain hour, the time of day when ghosts and operatives do their best work. I closed the laptop and watched the sun begin to creep over the lake, knowing that in 4 hours I would walk my daughter toward a man who thought he was marrying a fortune, only to find he was wedded to a debt. My wedding preparations were far from traditional. A simple silk tie can be a decorative accessory or a garrote, depending on which side of the agency life you retired from, but today it was just the final piece of my armor. I stood before the bathroom mirror, the rasp of a razor against my jaw, the only sound in the silent house. I meticulously prepared my physical appearance, choosing a high-quality charcoal suit. It looked like the attire of a dignified father, but the fabric was woven with a flexible ballistic layer, a hidden weight that pressed against my chest, as a reminder of the syndicate enforcers I expected to encounter at the altar. I checked my specialized watch, a heavy steel chronograph that did more than tell time. I pressed a recessed button to sync its internal digital pulse to the FBI's mission clock, T-7 hours. The scent of crisp cedar from the closet clung to my jacket as I stepped back into my study. The morning sun was beginning to reflect off the silver-framed photo of my late wife Helena, creating a blinding glare that forced me to squint. I took a moment to look at her face, acknowledging the silent promise I had made to keep our daughter safe from the shadows that eventually claimed her life. "I'm sorry you have to see this, Helena," I whispered. "But I won't let them take her." The rhythmic buzzing of my encrypted phone on the mahogany desk broke the silence, pulling me back into the cold reality of the tactical field. Before I reveal the detail in the final briefing that changed the entire scope of the mission, are you still with me? Choose A if you think I should proceed alone, or B if I should trust the Bureau. And add one short reason so I can see how you're reading this. Please note that the following contains dramatized details added for narrative impact. The purpose is reflection on the lengths a protector must go. I picked up the device, my thumbprint authorizing the decrypted transmission. The final briefing from Vance Prescott was a map of a silent invasion. He confirmed the tactical positioning of 20 undercover agents already filtering toward St. Jude's. They were taking their places as caterers, ushers, and even high society guests in borrowed tuxedos. Vance's text confirmed that the cascading signal was live, meaning the multimedia override in the cathedral was primed for my remote trigger. We both knew that once the first arrest was made, there would be no turning back from the public exposure of my past. I messaged him back telling him to ensure they wait for the Korean signal, so the Maxwells would hear their ruin in their own tongue. Vance's final attachment was a thermal scan of the honeymoon luggage. It revealed that Brian Maxwell had requested an armed escort for the honeymoon, a clear indication that the syndicate planned to move Clare out of the country the moment the reception ended. My phone buzzed with the final confirmation: 20 agents in position. The trap was set, and the only thing left to do was give my daughter away to a man I was about to destroy. The spire of St. Jude's Cathedral pierced the Chicago sky like a jagged needle, a monument to a faith I was about to test with absolute evidence. The limestone gargoyles stared down at the arriving Ferraris and Bentleys with silent judgment. But I was the only one who knew the sanctity of this cathedral was about to be traded for the sterile precision of a federal takedown. I stepped out of my car, my posture stoic, as I entered the grand vestibule, feeling the cold weight of the ballistic vest beneath my charcoal suit. I had hacked the cathedral's digital pipe organ system to act as a secondary signal jammer earlier that morning. Once I triggered the sequence, the Maxwells wouldn't be able to call a single soul for reinforcements. My eyes performed a high-speed sweep of the perimeter, ignoring the lavish floral arrangements and focusing on the human elements. I identified Vance's agents through subtle tells that only a man of my background would notice, the way an usher carried himself with the rigid discipline of a paratrooper, the discreet acoustic coil tucked behind a caterer's ear, and the so-called high society guest whose tuxedo was tailored just a bit too loosely to hide a Glock 19. "Lovely day for a wedding, isn't it?" an usher whispered as I passed the prearranged countersign for clear. "It's a day for settling accounts." I replied, my voice a low, clinical baritone, as I moved deeper into the lion's den. There. Pew 4. The cousin with the military-grade posture and the bulging waistband. The game was officially afoot. The smell of expensive floor wax and old incense filled my lungs, a scent that usually brought peace, but now only sharpened my focus. I intentionally bypassed the reserved front-row seating marked for the father of the bride. I needed the tactical advantage of the high ground and a clear line of sight to the exits. I found a spot in the very back, sliding into the cold texture of the wooden pew near the heavy oak doors. I watched the elite of Chicago file in, the men who likely owed Brian money, and the women who envied Claire's success, unaware that their social circle was about to become a crater. I felt the remote trigger in my pocket, a small black plastic box that held the power to burn a dynasty. It was a strange sensation sitting among the wealthy while holding the match that would incinerate their afternoon. The cathedral was a beautiful hollow shell, a stage set for a play that was about to transition from a romance to a tragedy in 3 languages. The bright, multicolored glare from the stained glass windows painted the stone floor in shades of blood and sapphire, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a courtroom than a sanctuary. I looked toward the altar and saw Brian Maxwell. He was leaning down, whispering intently to a man who wasn't a groomsman or a relative. I recognized that face. It was a known syndicate enforcer I had seen in the warehouse meeting photos. The accident wasn't just a future plan. It was already being coordinated right here under the eyes of God and the FBI. The first heavy chord of the organ shook the floorboards, the vibrating bass rattling my very bones as the music announced the start of the processional. As the great doors began to swing open for the bride, I felt my heart harden into the stone of the walls around me, ready for the storm. The doors groaned open, and there she was, a vision in white silk, walking toward her own destruction with a smile I had spent a lifetime trying to protect. The heavy oak doors didn't just open. They exhaled the scent of 1,000 white lilies, a floral shroud for the daughter I was about to lose, to a man who saw her as a bank account with a pulse. Claire stood at the threshold, radiant and shimmering under the blinding rainbow glare of the stained glass. But she was isolated by her own defiance. She began the long walk down the aisle alone, her chin tilted high, a public statement of independence that felt like a physical blow to my chest. As she drew nearer to my back row seat, I noticed a sapphire pendant around her neck that I didn't recognize, a gift from Eleanor, no doubt. My tactical training flared as I spotted the pinhole aperture in the setting. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a directional microphone, meaning every word my daughter spoke today was being recorded as leverage for the Maxwells. I leaned forward as she passed, the rhythmic thumping of my heart heavy against my ballistic vest. "I love you, Claire." I whispered, my voice a ghost of a sound. "Please just look at me." She walked past me like I was part of the architecture, a stone pillar, a relic of a past she wanted to burn. She didn't flinch, her gaze remaining locked on the man waiting at the altar. "Let me live my life, Dad." She murmured the words so low they were meant only for us, yet they carried the weight of a final judgment. But my failed whisper wasn't just a plea. It was a voice command trigger for the data skimmer I had successfully lost in the lobby earlier. Deep within the building's infrastructure, the device acknowledged my vocal signature and initiated the final breach of the Sterling Logistics main server. I sat back in the shadows, watching the white silk of her train hiss against the cold marble floor, the sound of a fuse burning toward an explosion only I could hear. The church was full of people who saw a fairy tale, but I saw a crime scene in progress, a hostile takeover disguised as a holy sacrament. I could feel the cold precision of the mission clock, ticking in my mind, each second bringing us closer to the point of no return. Claire reached the front of the cathedral, where Brian Maxwell waited with a smile as bright and hollow as a polished coin. I watched from the darkness of the rear pew as he took her hand, his thumbs tracing her skin with a possessive ease that made my blood run cold. "I'm finally here, Brian," she said, her voice echoing through the nave. "No more ghosts." Brian leaned in, whispering that she looked breathtaking, but I saw the predator's grin behind the groom's mask. Sunlight from the high windows cast a deceptive, holy glow over them, a beautiful lie painted in light. The moment felt transactional, a handover of assets rather than a union of souls. I looked toward Father O'Brien, who stood like a silent sentinel over the proceedings. He cleared his throat and opened the heavy liturgy book, the dry, paper-like sound of the pages turning, carrying clearly in the vaulted space. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the burden of the deception we were about to facilitate together. He prepared to begin the most expensive lie in the history of the parish, and I prepared to end it. Brian took Clare's hands in his thumbs tracing the skin where she would soon wear his ring, a shackle he had spent 6 months forging. Listening to Brian Maxwell promise to cherish my daughter was like watching a snake describe the warmth of the sun. It was a performance so polished, it made the holy water in the font feel oily. He delivered a poetic pre-written set of vows that focused heavily on building a shared empire and merging 2 worlds into one. I watched from the back row, my eyes tracking Eleanor Maxwell in the front row. She was looking at Clare not with maternal love, but with the hungry appraisal of a butcher eyeing a prime cut. Brian subtly touched his lapel, revealing a hidden earpiece of his own. He was receiving live updates from the syndicate enforcers about my position in the back pew. Clare wiped a tear of genuine joy, completely oblivious that her fiancé was reciting a script designed by a syndicate psychologist to elicit maximum trust. I promise to be the partner who carries half of every burden, Clare, he said, through the metallic echo of the PA system. He's not carrying the burden, he's measuring the weight for transport. I muttered, my voice lost in the soaring cathedral acoustics. Empire. He used that word 3 times. Predators always reveal themselves through their vocabulary, if you know how to listen for the tells. I felt the haptic buzz of my phone against my thigh, a sharp vibration that cut through the romantic haze of the ceremony. It was Vance confirming that all perimeter teams were green and in position. I didn't hesitate. I reached into my pocket, my fingers finding the specialized controls on my watch. I typed the code word cascading and hit send. Immediately, I smelled the faint scent of ozone as the church's hidden projector system hummed to life, slaved to my remote trigger. Clare began her vows, but for a second, her eyes searched the front rows, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Dad, where are you?" she seemed to ask with her gaze before she regained her focus on Brian. She didn't realize that I had moved to the high ground to ensure her survival. I watched the sunlight hitting the polished silver rings, a brilliant sparkle that felt like the flash of a muzzle in the dark. Have you ever seen a man smile while he's hanging a noose? Brian Maxwell was an artist of the craft. His mother watched him with a pride that was purely financial. Her hands folded over a silk clutch that I knew held the forged transfer papers. In my peripheral vision, I noticed a second black sedan pull up to the heavy cathedral doors. The men stepping out weren't FBI agents. They carried the blunt, heavy movements of Macau enforcers. Brian's debt had come due, and they weren't here for the cake. They were here to collect the bride as collateral. My throat felt cold and dry. As I prepared to speak, the silence of the church, suddenly heavy with the gravity of the coming strike. Father O'Brien took a deep breath, his voice booming through the speakers as he reached the question that would either end my daughter's life or start her salvation. If anyone can show just 'cause why these 2 may not lawfully be joined, let them speak. Now or else forever hold their peace. I felt the remote trigger click in my palm, and the first slide of the digital evidence flashed across the white stone walls. I didn't wait for the silence to stretch. I stood up the legs of my wooden pew, scraping against the marble like a gunshot in a library, and for the first time in 20 years, I let my true voice echo in a room full of people. I projected my words with a cold, lethal authority that cut through the romantic air of the cathedral. I didn't address the altar in English. Instead, I spoke in flawless, razor-sharp Korean, repeating the exact insults Eleanor had spat at me during dinner. I called Brian a gogi, a slaughterhouse animal, and identified Eleanor not as a high society matriarch, But as the disgraced Sultang broker, I had personally hunted and shut down in Seoul 20 years ago. The Maxwell family froze their heads, whipping around in a synchronized snap of terror. The decrepit peasant they had mocked was gone, replaced by the ghost who had ended their first reign of greed. Eleanor's face drained of color, her diamond-clad hands beginning to tremble against her silk gown as she stammered in our shared second language, demanding to know who I really was. "You should have checked the room for shadows." "Eleanor," I replied in that same staccato Korean, "I understood every word of your slaughterhouse dinner." Silence. Then the sound of 300 hearts stopping at once. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the reaper. The audible gasp of the 400 guests created a vacuum of shock that seemed to pull the oxygen from the nave. I switched to English, my voice steady and clinical, informing the entire congregation of the Maxwells' true intent. I laid out the mechanics of their fraud, explaining how they intended to use my daughter as a financial vault to launder Macau gambling debts before arranging a convenient accident for her once the honeymoon began. Claire stood paralyzed at the altar, her bouquet trembling so violently that white petals began to drift onto the marble like snow. "Dad, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice cracking with a profound devastation. You speak Korean." I looked at her, the dry, metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth, and saw the world I had built to protect her finally collapsing under the weight of the truth. I told her that they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a logistics hub for a criminal syndicate. Ever see an empress turn back into a gutter rat in 6 syllables? It's a beautiful sight. Eleanor's composed facade didn't just crack, it disintegrated. But the revelation went deeper than my words. I revealed to the panicked groom and his mother that the sapphire pendant around Claire's neck, the one they had used to record her, had been compromised. I had patched that directional microphone directly into the church's PA system minutes ago. Brian's frantic whispered confessions of guilt, his pleas to his mother to find a way out, were now booming through the speakers for every elite guest to hear. The aroma of ozone from the heating projector bulbs began to fill the air as the technical override reached its climax. Brian looked at the speakers as if they were judge and jury, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of realization. I pressed the remote in my pocket, and the giant screens behind the altar flickered to life, not with photos of Claire's childhood, but with the high-definition bank transfers and forged documents that would send Brian Maxwell to prison for the rest of his natural life. The screen didn't just illuminate the room. It blinded the Maxwells with the one thing their world was designed to avoid: the irrefutable digital truth. The stained glass usually told stories of saints and salvation, but as the high-definition projectors hummed to life, the light that filled St. Jude's was the cold, clinical glare of a federal audit. I felt the sharp, rhythmic thud of my thumb on the remote as I bypassed the church's pre-programmed montage. Brian lunged toward the ushers, screaming at them to turn it off, but I had already anticipated his panic. The projectors were running on an independent battery backup I'd hidden within the cathedral's electrical housing weeks ago. Instead of childhood photos, a split-screen comparison of the prenuptial agreement appeared in massive blue-white clarity. On the left was the version Claire signed. On the right was Brian's forged page 8 with the fraudulent cross-ownership clause highlighted in an aggressive, pulsing red. "Look at the screen, Claire," I commanded, my voice cutting through the rising tide of shocked whispers. "That's not a marriage contract. It's a bill of sale for your legacy and everything I built to keep you safe." Red. Page 8 was bleeding red on the screen. The color of a forgery. The color of a daughter's betrayal at the hands of a man she trusted. The aroma of ozone and hot electronics drifted through the nave as the 400 guests erupted into a chaotic murmur. I watched Brian's sweat-soaked tuxedo collar wilt under the heat of the exposure. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the exits where my agents were already waiting. I clicked the remote again, and the contract vanished, replaced by the $12.4 million gambling debt ledger I'd purchased from the syndicate. I zoomed in on the signatures, the high-definition scan revealing Brian's name etched next to those of known Macau mob enforcers. I announced to the room that the man at the altar wasn't a brilliant investment banker, but a Priority 1 federal target who had collateralized his own mother's retirement fund to cover a losing streak in tech derivatives. Eleanor Maxwell slumped into her seat in the front row, the silver silk of her gown finally matching the deathly gray of her complexion. Do you know what happens to a high society reputation when you broadcast a $12 million mob debt to the whole city? It evaporates faster than holy water on a hot skillet. I watched Claire's bouquet slip from her fingers, the lilies hitting the marble floor, as she turned to stare at the man she thought was her future. "Brian, tell me this is a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking over the PA system for every guest to hear. He had no answer. "He didn't just bet your future, Claire," I told her from the shadows of the back row. "He bet his mother's life on a horse that was already dead." I noticed the guests in the third row. Men Brian believed were his wealthy venture capital partners leaned forward with tablet computers. They were actually the team of forensic accountants I'd hired to catalog every Maxwell asset in real time for immediate seizure. They were already stripping the skin off the wolf before the body was even cold. As the crowd watched the debt totals tick upward on the screen, I tapped the final command on my watch, and the church's sound system began to play an audio file that would break my daughter's heart once and for all. The first sound to come through the speakers wasn't music, but the clink of a silver fork against a porcelain plate, the beginning of the end for the man who thought he could use my daughter as a sacrificial lamb. The tinny, echoing sound of the dinner recording filled the vaulted space of St. Jude's, accompanied by crisp English subtitles flashing on the giant screens. Eleanor Maxwell tried to flee through the side door the moment her own voice filled the room, but she found the heavy oak barrier electronically locked by the hack I had embedded in the church's security system. She was forced to stand and listen to her own criminal confessions in front of the very socialites she had spent years trying to impress. The congregation sat in a stunned, suffocating silence as they heard Brian and Eleanor laughing about Claire's stupidity. Brian's voice, amplified and inescapable, described my daughter as a clean vessel for dirty water. He lunged toward the multimedia booth, his face a mask of sweating panic. But he was blocked by two ushers who were actually Vance's undercover agents. "Stop it. That's a lie. It's AI." Brian screamed, his aristocratic mask finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. 30 seconds of audio. That's all it took to turn a wedding into a wake. The sharp, metallic scent of terror began to drift through the air, replacing the sweet fragrance of the lilies. I watched Claire from the back row. She looked as though she had been struck by a physical force. The audio continued relentless and clinical. The guests heard the exchange where Brian told his mother to give Sophia Vance 72 hours. He promised that once Claire signed the joint authority papers at the altar, the Gold Coast would be the least of what they owned. I watched Brian's rhythmic, heavy breathing through my tactical binoculars, seeing the precise moment he realized the game was over. He looked at Claire, but there was no love left in his eyes, only the desperate, hollow calculation of a man seeing his exit routes vanish. Every word they had whispered in that private dining room was now public record, etched into the memories of Chicago's elite like a permanent stain. I watched my daughter's heart break in real time, the sound of her world splintering louder than any organ pipe. The recording reached its final, most lethal segment. Eleanor's voice discussed the mechanical failure intended for Claire's car shortly after the honeymoon. Claire's legs finally gave out. She dropped her bouquet, the white orchids scattering across the cold marble floor like fallen snow. Her silk dress crumpled onto the altar steps as she collapsed, her body racking with silent, violent sobs. "A mechanical failure, Brian," I asked, my own voice booming over the sound system cutting through the recording. "Did you choose the bridge yet?" Claire looked up at the man she had almost called husband, her face reflecting the terrifying realization that she had been sleeping next to her own executioner. "Dad, please make it stop." She sobbed, her voice a broken whisper that tore through my remaining resolve. I revealed to the room that the Sophia Vance mentioned in the tapes had already been apprehended by Interpol in Seoul, and her full confession was the next file queued for the screen, as Claire's sobs filled the silent church. Agent Vance Prescott stood up in the third row and placed his hand on his weapon, his eyes locked on me for the final command. I didn't say a word. I just gave Vance the nod, the signal to let the wolves of the law finish what the Maxwells started. I didn't need to shout for order. The sound of 20 tactical safety catches clicking off in unison provided a much more effective silence than any priest's prayer. Undercover FBI agents, who had been standing as polite ushers and distinguished guests, shed their roles with lethal, choreographed precision. One of Brian's groomsmen, a man who had supposedly been his college roommate, suddenly pinned Brian's arm behind his back. I had embedded that plant in Brian's inner circle 6 months ago to ensure this exact moment would happen. Vance Prescott led the charge to the altar, his weapon drawn and steady. Brian lunged instinctively toward Clare, his fingers clawing at her white silk sleeve as if he could use her as a human shield. But the groomsman was faster, slamming him face first into the cold marble. The perimeter agents moved like shadows, blocking the syndicate enforcers at the back doors and neutralizing the threat before a single socialite could even draw breath to scream. The cathedral was transformed into a high-security tactical box, the air thick with the sharp metallic scent of gun oil and the sterile white light of the church's emergency flashes. Brian Maxwell. You're under arrest for federal wire fraud, felony forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder, Vance announced, his voice booming over the still-active altar microphone for the entire congregation to hear. You can't do this. Do you know who my investors are? Brian shrieked, his aristocratic mask replaced by the raw, ugly terror of a cornered rat. Click. Handcuffs are the only jewelry Brian Maxwell will be wearing for the next decade. I watched from the back row, my arms crossed over my ballistic vest, as the rhythmic thud of tactical boots on marble replaced the wedding march. My daughter stood frozen, her eyes wide and glassy, watching the man she thought was her future being treated like the common criminal he always was. The weight of the steel restraints, snapping shut, echoed through the nave, a final punctuation mark on the lie that had almost cost Clare her life. I felt a grim, kinetic sense of justice as the room finally realized that the old man in the back wasn't just a spectator. Do you know what the most satisfying sound in the world is? It's the silence of a narcissist who realizes the room has stopped believing his lies. Eleanor Maxwell tried to pivot, her high-pitched heels screeching against the floor as she attempted to ditch her luxury clutch near a side pew. 2 female agents intercepted her before she could move 5 feet, seizing the bag I knew contained the encrypted syndicate ledgers. She erupted into a feral rage, her silver silk gown tearing, as she struggled with an animalistic fury against the iron grip of the law. "Get your hands off me, I am a Maxwell," she screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "No, ma'am," I whispered, as I began to walk down the center aisle, passing her as she was forced to her knees. "You're just a case file with a bad attitude." As Brian was led away in tears, he began to shout in frantic Korean that he did it for Eleanor, desperately revealing that his mother was the true architect of the forgery. I didn't stop until I reached the altar, standing over Brian as he knelt in disgrace. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a final set of papers that didn't have the FBI seal, but the heavy embossed logo of Apex Capital. I looked down at the man who tried to steal my daughter's future, and for the first time today, I let the clinical mask slip into a smile. Brian looked up at me with the eyes of a trapped animal, but he didn't realize that the hunter standing over him didn't just want him in a cage, he wanted to own the air he breathed. The FBI agents were beginning to clear the room, their movements a blur of tactical efficiency, but I leaned down, whispering so only he could hear. I tapped the cold, heavy feel of the Apex Capital folder against his chest. "The $12 million debt you owed the syndicate is mine now, Brian. I bought it." And I funded the purchase with the very inheritance you tried to siphon from Clare, making you the primary victim of your own bottomless greed. His face shifted from pure terror to a soul-crushing realization that the federal sentence awaiting him was a mercy compared to my reach. The syndicate would have killed you quickly. I murmured, my voice a calm, wise rasp. But I'm going to keep you alive, healthy, and utterly broke for the next 40 years. You won't own so much as a wristwatch without my permission. You're a monster. He choked out, his aristocratic poise dissolving into a pathetic whimper. You're worse than them. I didn't disagree. I simply watched him as he was hauled away. I won. That's what the manual says. Every objective was met, every threat neutralized. So why did it feel like I was the one being led away in chains? I turned to find Clare, expecting a moment of shared relief. But I was met with a storm of fury that hit me harder than any physical strike. She stood amidst the wreckage of her wedding, her bouquet a mangled heap of crushed lilies and ozone-scented air. She didn't thank me. She erupted, screaming that I hadn't saved her. I had just proven that every single person in her life was a professional liar. You didn't do this for me, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high stone arches. You did this to prove you were right. You destroyed my life to satisfy your own paranoia. Clare, wait, everything I did to protect you. I pleaded, reaching out a hand. She recoiled as if I were a leper gathering her torn silk train with a trembling hand. You're just a ghost, Dad. A ghost who kills everything he touches. I don't ever want to see you again. The cathedral was empty now, a hollow shell of white lilies and broken promises that smelled more like a funeral than a wedding ever could. I watched the sight of Clare's torn white train vanishing into the blinding sunlight of the open doors, refusing to look back at the ruin I had crafted for her own good. I was left alone in the nave, the silence of the church more deafening than the high-pitched receding wail of police sirens fading into the Chicago traffic. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph of Helena. Looking at her smile, I realized with a sickening clarity that I had become the exact man she had died trying to protect Clare from, a man of shadows who sacrificed love for the sake of a mission. The echoing slam of the cathedral doors rang out like a final judgment, leaving me in the gathering gloom. I stood in the center of the aisle, the cold stone floor anchoring me to a hollow victory, and realized that in saving my daughter's life, I had successfully killed her father. 6 months later, the Chicago winter had set in a cold that matched the silence in my house and the distance in my daughter's eyes. The flickering blue light of the television was the only company I kept these days, a pale ghost of the fire that used to burn in this hearth when Clare was still a child who believed her father was just a simple man. I sat in the darkened living room, the mechanical hum of the refrigerator, the only other sound in a home that felt too large for one person. On the screen, a news anchor was conducting a media autopsy of what they called the cathedral sting. They dissected Brian Maxwell's fall from grace with a morbid fascination, detailing the $12 million debt and the deep-seated ties to Macau syndicates that had been unearthed. The report mentioned that even my modest textile firm had been liquidated in the fallout, making me appear to the public as just another victim of Brian's predatory scheme. It was a useful lie, one that buried my true role in the debris. Grainy footage showed Eleanor being led into a federal courthouse, her head bowed in a way I never thought I'd see. I sipped my stale tea. The liquid cold and bitter feeling, no joy in the victory. I did what I had to do. I whispered to the shadows, but why does it feel like I played a losing hand? Is it a rescue if the person you saved never wants to see your face again? That was the question that had been gnawing at me for half a year. I watched the news cycle pivot to a live clip of Clare standing on the steps of Sterling Logistics. She looked older, her features sharpened by the ordeal, but she possessed a resilience that made my chest tighten with a painful pride. She was announcing the successful purge of all Maxwell influence from her company, speaking about transparency and moving forward alone. She never once mentioned my name. As she spoke, The distant sound of sirens drifted in from the street, a reminder of the world I had used to save her. She told the reporters that Sterling Logistics remained a legacy, but a family of one from this day forward. I watched her every micro-expression searching for the girl I knew. She's strong, Helena, I thought, looking at the silver-framed photo on the mantel. Just like you. And just as angry. I reached out and touched the cold silk of the necktie. I still wore a habit of a man who no longer had a mission, but couldn't quite stand down. Justice is a cold dinner. I've been eating it for 40 years. It fills the stomach, but it never quite warms the blood. As the news segment ended, I saw a subtle hand gesture Claire made as she adjusted her papers. It was a small 3-finger tap against her thumb, a sign we had used when she was 5 years old to indicate she was safe. It was quick, almost invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime studying her, but it was there. She knew I was watching. She was safe, and in her own way she was letting the ghost know. As I reached out to turn off the television, a single encrypted notification chirped on my phone. The screen flickered with a message from a blocked number. There was no text, only a set of coordinates for a specific park bench I hadn't visited in 20 years. I stood up, my knees popping in the silence, and felt the old familiar weight of anticipation return to my gut. The coordinates weren't just a location. They were a summons from the only part of my life I had tried to keep alive. I was reaching for my coat, my mind already scanning the sightlines of the park coordinates, when the heavy thud of the brass knocker against my front door stopped my heart in a way no syndicate assassin ever could. I didn't need a GPS to find the park. The map was etched into the part of my brain where I kept my only happy memories, but the shadow on my doorstep wasn't a memory. I opened the door to find Claire standing in the late autumn rain, looking nothing like the polished CEO from the news. She was wearing an old hoodie from her college days, the fabric damp and clinging, and she carried a heavy weathered leather satchel that looked like it weighed 100 pounds. The reek of damp wool and rain-slicked pavement filled the entrance hall. "You're not at the park?" I said, the words coming out as a breathless rasp. "I sent those coordinates to see if you'd still run toward the shadows, Dad," she replied, her eyes hollow and searching. "I'm already here." She pushed past me into the house, her boots tracking wet leaves onto the hardwood, and headed straight for the study, the room that had been strictly off-limits for as long as she could remember. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the silent house felt like a countdown. The park bench had been a loyalty test, a lure, to see if the station king was still active in the network, and my readiness to go had confirmed every dark suspicion she harbored. Claire dropped the leather satchel onto my mahogany desk, the heavy thud of paper hitting wood echoing like a final gavel. She unbuckled the straps with trembling hands, revealing a mountain of documents. The secret was out. Not just the Maxwells' secret. Mine. She told me she had spent the last 6 weeks using her own forensic team to bypass every redaction in the FBI file Vance had conveniently left in her evidence locker. She looked at me, and I saw the blueprints of a prison she'd lived in her entire life without noticing the bars. She began pulling out the yellowed, brittle texture of old mission reports, laying them out like a map of my sins. "I read it," she whispered. "All of it. The Section 8 reports the Macau cables, the extractions in Seoul. I know about the Silver Shepherd protocol. I know why Mom really died." I stood paralyzed, the weight of 20 years of lies collapsing onto my shoulders. "I never wanted that paper to be your inheritance, Claire," I whispered. But the words felt thin and useless. She looked at the room with a painful clarity, finally understanding that every boring business trip to Tokyo or Frankfurt was a shadow war fought to keep the wolves from her bedroom. She looked at me like I was a stranger, yet for the first time she was truly seeing me. She pulled a single blood-stained document from the bottom of the bag, the original mission report from the night Helena died, and laid it over my heart. But then her hand dived back into the satchel, pulling out a second hidden file. She had found the account ledgers, showing that for the last decade, I had been anonymously funding Sterling Logistics' global expansion through a shell company in the Caymans. I wasn't just a ghost protecting her. I was the silent partner who had built the very pedestal she stood on. Claire stood in the threshold of my study, holding the physical evidence of my secret life, the rain-damp silk of her hoodie the only thing keeping her from shattering. I looked at the report. The ink faded by time, but the tragedy still as sharp as a fresh blade, and I realized the only lie left was the one I was telling myself. I looked at the rust-colored stain on the folder, the physical remains of the day my world ended, and realized I could no longer hide behind the shadow of the man I used to be. For 20 years, I had let Claire believe her mother died in a random, tragic car accident. I sat at my mahogany desk, the soft, rhythmic ticking of the study clock, the only sound in the room until I finally broke my silence. I told her the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a retaliatory strike by a cartel I had dismantled during my time in Seoul. I didn't lie because I was ashamed of the work, Claire, I said, my voice thick with cathartic grief. I lied because your mother's last breath was a plea to keep you out of the light. She wanted you to have a life where you never had to look over your shoulder. I spent the rest of my years playing the simple textile man to ensure the remaining threats never saw you as a target. I described the hidden agony of watching her resent my perceived weakness while I was secretly coordinating with global intelligence assets to keep the monsters at bay. You let me hate you for being ordinary, she whispered, the salt of a shared final tear trailing down her cheek. You were the only thing keeping the wolves away, and I treated you like a burden. The truth was a heavy garment I'd worn for 20 years. Taking it off felt like catching my first real breath since 2004. I revealed to her a detail I had never shared with another living soul. The Silver Shepherd code name wasn't a title given to me by the agency. It was a name Helena gave me in her private journals, the only piece of her I never burned. It was her way of acknowledging the man who guarded the flock in the dark. Claire looked at me, her eyes reflecting the warm, flickering orange light of the hearth, and I saw the blueprints of the prison she'd lived in finally being replaced by a home. The fire didn't just consume the paper. It consumed the ghost. Claire took a lighter from the desk and held it to the corner of the blood-stained mission report. We sat together in the silence, the reek of burning paper and cedarwood filling the air as we watched the secrets turn to ash in the fireplace. The weight of the Silver Shepherd protocol finally lifted from my chest. My daughter was no longer a target to be managed. She was a partner who knew the truth. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small ancient key to a safe deposit box. It wasn't filled with the laundered millions or technical schematics Brian had craved. It was filled with Helena's personal letters and the mementos I had hidden away to protect Claire from the pain. The shadows are gone, Dad, Claire said softly, her hand covering mine. You don't have to be a ghost anymore. I think I'd like to try being a father for a while, I replied. Just a father. I revealed that while I had truly retired, I had left a digital dead man's switch in place that would automatically protect Sterling Logistics forever, a silent guardian that required no more lies. I looked at Claire, the firelight reflecting in eyes that finally saw me for who I was, and for the first time in my life, I didn't check the door for a shadow. The scent of garlic and rosemary in my kitchen was a far cry from the metallic tang of gun oil, a quiet victory in a war that had finally moved from the shadows to the dinner table. 3 months had passed since the cathedral incident, and the heavy silence of my home was finally being filled with the sounds of a living family. I stood at the stove, feeling the comfortable weight of a ceramic plate in my hand as I plated the chicken. It was our new Sunday ritual, a fragile bridge we were building one meal at a time. I had spent decades monitoring her safety through encrypted feeds, but watching her sit at my dining table pouring herself a glass of wine was the only intelligence report I ever truly wanted. I noticed the cool condensation on her wine glass as she looked over her shoulder at me, her face lacking the rigid defensiveness that had defined our relationship for years. The entry twist of our current piece was a secret I still held close. The anonymous tip that led Korean police to Sophia Vance's safe house weeks ago hadn't been a stroke of luck. It was a digital breadcrumb trail I had meticulously planted during the poison pill protocol, a final insurance policy to ensure the Maxwells stayed buried. The quarterly numbers are up, Dad Clare said, her voice carrying a light, authentic confidence. Without the silent partners draining the accounts, we're actually thriving. I set her plate down and took my seat, the soft evening breeze through an open window carrying the scent of a peaceful Chicago autumn. I never doubted you could run that ship, Claire, I told her, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a tactical assessment. I just wanted to make sure nobody sank it first. 6 months ago, I was buying a man's debt in a warehouse. Tonight, I'm arguing about the best way to roast a chicken. The contrast was enough to make me smile, a real one that reached my eyes. We focused on the mundane details of her work and my supposed retirement hobbies, avoiding the ghosts of the agency or the Maxwells. I watched her across the table, seeing a woman who had found her own strength without needing a shadow to lean on. She was her mother's daughter, sharp, resilient, and finally truly independent. The television screen in the corner was a portal to a world I'd walked in for decades. But for the first time, I was just an observer on the outside looking in. As we finished our meal, a notification chirped on the secure phone I still kept in my pocket. I glanced at it, seeing the coded confirmation from Vance. He says they found her, I said softly, sharing the piece of the puzzle with Claire. Sophia Vance is in custody in Seoul. We turned toward the news, watching the blue flicker of the international broadcast. There she was, the woman who was meant to replace my daughter, now just a face behind reinforced glass in a Korean courthouse. It's finally over, isn't it? Claire whispered. The ghosts are all in cages. I nodded, feeling the final open loop of the Maxwell conspiracy close. Then came the second twist of the evening. Claire admitted she had been taking Korean lessons. She didn't want to understand the Maxwells. She wanted to understand the culture I had lived in for so long. Claire looked at the screen, then back at me and asked a question I wasn't prepared for. So, Dad, what was Seoul really like when you were young? The story I told Claire didn't involve codes or wiretaps. It started with the reeked of rain in a marketplace, and the man I was before I became a shepherd. 7 months had passed since the day the Maxwells were led away in steel, and the Chicago autumn had arrived with a blinding clarity that seemed to wash the city clean. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually meant I was alone with my failures. But today, the crunch of frost-covered gravel beneath 2 sets of feet sounded like a truce. I walked beside Claire toward the familiar granite slab under the ancient oak tree. I had already bought the plot next to Helena years ago, a silent preparation for a lonely exit. But as I felt the soft, warm weight of Claire's hand in mine, I realized I wasn't in a hurry to occupy it anymore. I placed a single white lily on the granite. It was the same flower that had mocked me at the cathedral, but here in the cold morning light, it finally represented a completed cycle of protection. I kept her safe, Helena, I whispered in the private chapel of my mind. Just like I said I would. The secret she died for had finally been unburdened, and the silence between my daughter and me was no longer a wall, but a shared bridge of grief and understanding. She would have been proud of the man you were. Dad, Claire said softly, her voice steady. And the one you're finally becoming. I didn't check the rearview mirror once on the drive over. The habit of a lifetime, a reflexive scan for shadows and tales, had been broken by a single morning of truth. After leaving the cemetery, I stopped by St. Jude's Cathedral alone. The scent of burning incense and cold stone greeted me, a familiar comfort for a man who had spent his life in the dark. Father O'Brien met me in the sacristy, his eyes as wise and weary as ever. I handed him an envelope, a final massive donation from the Apex Capital accounts. It was the remains of the Maxwell debt I had liquidated, blood-stained currency that needed to be laundered into something holy. Consider this the final audit of the Maxwell estate, Father. I said the words carrying a weight of finality. This will fund the new sanctuary for victims of domestic financial abuse. We shared a silent nod of mutual respect. He knew the necessary sins I had committed in the name of a higher good, and he accepted the tithe without judgment. "Go in peace, Alaric," he replied, his voice gravel over silk. The ledger is clean. I walked through the heavy oak doors and felt the autumn sun warming my face. The money wasn't mine to keep. It was a ghost's treasure, and I was done being a ghost. Earlier that morning, I had destroyed the last physical copies of the Silver Shepherd files, watching the yellowed pages curl into ash. I kept only the memories that Clare now shares with me. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't looking for the exit or scanning the crowd for a threat. I reached into my pocket and touched the rough texture of the granite dust on my fingertips, a reminder of where I had been. I was no longer an operative, a fixer, or a station king. I was just a man walking down the cathedral steps into a bright Chicago afternoon. I breathed in the crisp, cold air and realized the only mission left was the one I had ignored for far too long living. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the sun high and brilliant, and for the first time in my life, I didn't check the door for a shadow. For 30 years, I lived in a house full of exits. Tonight, for the first time, I finally felt like I was standing in a home. The project was complete, but the silence that followed wasn't the hollow quiet of a finished mission. It was the peaceful stillness of a room that no longer needed to hide its occupant. I returned to my study, the golden glow of the lamp, casting long, soft shadows that didn't feel threatening for once. I didn't check for bugs, and I didn't monitor any hidden feeds. Instead, I began to clear out the remnants of my tactical life with a slow, deliberate pace. I packed the safe deposit key and the few remaining non-classified mementos of my career, an old watch, a compass from a life lived in the brush, a few photographs without names into a small wooden chest. The weight of the chest in my hands felt substantial, a physical history that was finally coming to light. Clare arrived just as I was closing the lid. Her presence in the room no longer a tactical variable to be managed, but a daughter coming home. In that quiet, profound moment, I handed her the chest. "This is everything that's left, Clare," I told her. "No more redactions." She ran her fingers over the carved wood and told me she had already taken the Apex Capital Funds and established a scholarship in her mother's name. My war chest had become a tool for public good, and seeing the pride in her eyes made every cold night in the field worth the cost. Do you know what the most dangerous weapon in the world is? It's not a gun or a code. It's the truth told too late. I had narrowly avoided that mistake, and as we sat together in the study, I realized the simple man I had pretended to be wasn't just a cover. It was the man I always wished I could have been for her, a man who worried about the lawn and the weather instead of logistics and extractions. "I don't need the operative anymore, Dad," she said, her voice warm and clear. "I just need you." We sat in a silence that didn't require tactical analysis, just the soft evening breeze through the open window and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. I realized that the sheep I had spent a lifetime guarding had grown strong enough to lead the flock herself. Nightfall settled over the city, and the city lights below looked like a sea of stars. For once, I wasn't trying to navigate the dark between them. I stood by the window watching the Chicago skyline twinkle with a distant, peaceful hum. I watched Clare drive away, her taillights fading into the distance, knowing she was truly free of the Maxwells and my own heavy shadows. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. Alaric Sterling was a fine name, a strong cover that had served me well through a dozen countries and 100 crises. But as the ledger closed, I thought of the name on my birth certificate, a name I hadn't used since before the agency found me. I thought of Thomas, the boy who liked to read and didn't know how to lie. I was a shepherd who forgot that the sheep eventually grow strong enough to lead, but tonight the shepherd could finally rest. I turned away from the window and reached for the light switch, leaving the shadows exactly where they belonged in the past. Looking back now, I realize this was never just a battle against criminals. It became a painful family story that forced me to face the truth about the father I had been. For years, I believed silence was protection. I thought hiding my past would keep my daughter safe from the dangers of my world. But the hardest lesson from this family story is that secrets can slowly build walls between the people who love each other the most. If I could go back and speak to the man I once was, I would tell him this: do not protect your family by disappearing from their lives. Be honest before the distance becomes impossible to cross. Some people may look at everything that happened and call it a dad revenge, but in my heart, it was never truly about revenge. A dad revenge may stop a predator, but it cannot heal the damage caused by silence. This family story reminded me that love should never feel like control or manipulation. Fear can make even a good father choose the wrong path. In the end, I learned that protecting your family requires courage, honesty, and humility. A dad revenge might win a battle, but truth is what saves a family in the long run. I believe God allowed this storm to teach me that strength is not found in secrecy, but in trust and love. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. I truly appreciate you being here. If you were in Alaric's situation, forced to choose between revealing the truth or losing your daughter's trust, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved, you consider subscribing for more. Some parts of this narrative were dramatized for storytelling.